Today, we're jumping right in to deconstruct a really opinionated Sky News Australia segment about the response to U.S. action in Iran. We're going to break down its key arguments, the supercharged language it uses, and the whole narrative structure it builds to make its case.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at how the source frames the initial reactions to the event. Then, we'll dig into its main argument about what it calls the left. After that, we'll see which leaders get put under the microscope, how the media gets put on trial, and finally, how all of this gets tied into some bigger culture war flashpoints.
So right from the get-go, the segment takes this really complex global situation and just boils it down to a simple black and white choice. There's no room for nuance here. It's all about presenting two completely opposite reactions.
And this slide really nails that core idea. On one side, they show you what they call genuine celebrations, people fighting for freedom. And on the other side, they show you what they just dismiss as massive tantrums from anyone who disagrees with them.
Now, the source uses this clip of Israelis dancing in a bomb shelter as, powerful proof for its argument. They frame it as this viral celebration, and it's presented as the only morally correct response, what the host literally calls being on the right side of history.
And then, on the flip side, you get this. Ben Stiller's tweet is held up as the perfect example of the wrong reaction. The host uses it to say that this kind of sentiment isn't some principled stand, it's just, and I'm quoting here, tragic, sad loser behavior.
Okay, so let's see how they build on this. That initial contrast they set up, the celebrations versus the tantrums, it's not just about one event. Nope. It's the launching pad for their central thesis that there's a deep, fundamental problem with this big group they just label the left.
So according to the program, this group isn't just, wrong. It's driven by what they call a self-hatred movement. The argument they make is that this has caused a total loss of moral clarity, to the point where they can't tell the difference between the oppressed and the oppressors anymore.
And you absolutely can't talk about this segment without talking about the tone. The language isn't subtle, you guys. It's deliberately blunt, it's intense, and it's meant to frame the other side in these really stark, almost pathological terms.
I mean, wow. What's so interesting here is how it just captures the absolute extremity of the language they're using. They're not just disagreeing with a political view. They're painting it as this existential threat, something that's not just dumb, but suicidally stupid.
And this brings us to a term you hear over and over again in the segment, useful idiot. It's a very specific label they use to categorize and really to dismiss anyone who suggests things like dialogue or shows what they call misplaced mercy towards the Iranian regime.
So once they've established this whole framework, what do? Well, they start applying it directly to political leaders you'd recognize. These leaders are presented as the living, breathing examples of this whole ideology that the segment sees as a huge problem for the West.
The UK's Prime Minister gets called out with this claim that he's actually loved by extremists. And the logic the source presents is pretty wild. They argue it's not in spite of him being weak, it's because he's weak. That's why they supposedly love him.
When it comes to California's governor, the critique gets really personal, and it's also about his intellect. They mock an interview where he's rambling, they make fun of his appearance, and basically frame him as this completely empty suit. And the mayor of London? He's portrayed as dangerous for supposedly failing to stand up to radicalism. The argument is that he shuts down important conversations by calling them racist, and in doing so, he lets extremist ideas become normalized.
And this all builds to what is really the core theory one of the guests puts forward. The argument is that these Western leaders aren't really in charge. They're actually being controlled or subjugated by these internal groups that the source calls extremist and hard radical left.
So after going after the politicians, the segment widens its net and sets its sights on the media. The argument here isn't just that the media is biased, it's that the media is an active player in trying to weaken the West.
Now the source presents this as, Exhibit A, the smoking gun. They highlight how the BBC's translation changed the word regime to people, and they argue this wasn't some simple mistake. It was a deliberate choice to change the whole story and protect the Iranian government.
Then a guest, Bill O'Reilly, takes that same idea and applies it to American media. The argument he makes is that some outlets, like ABC News, aren't just biased. They actively want America to lose, and it's all because they have this personal hatred for Donald Trump.
And this is where things get really interesting. In the last part of the segment, the narrative takes this huge leap. It connects all these big geopolitical and media arguments to the social debates, the culture wars happening right here in Western countries.
So they pivot by throwing out this question, and they frame it as the hardest question that the left seemed to not be able to answer. It's used as a kind of bridge to suggest that there's this fundamental disconnect from reality that explains all the other problems they've been talking about. The program then walks us through this viral incident step by step to paint a picture of a world that's gone, well, completely upside down in their view. They call it complete nonsense, a situation where the person who speaks the truth gets punished by the institution. And see how they bring it all full circle? The guest, Tish Heyman, connects her own experience right back to that theme of failed leadership. The source uses her story to make the case that politicians are just totally out of touch, creating laws that don't reflect what ordinary people actually want or need.
Okay, so let's pull back and look at the whole narrative they've built. It's actually very clear. 1. They split the world into two sides, strong and weak. 2. They identify an enemy within, the left, that's making the West weaker. 3. They blame weak leaders and a biased media for letting it all happen. And 4. They conclude that the only way forward is with unapologetic, decisive action.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. Whatever your politics are, it's worth asking, what happens when we frame these incredibly complex issues not as problems we all need to solve, but as battles to be won between a clearly defined us and a clearly defined them?